I want to welcome the folks that are joining us online today. Thank you for joining us for another installment of our Sustainable Energy Seminar. My name is Scott Williams. I'm the Research and Education Coordinator at the Wisconsin Energy Institute. And the Sustainable Energy Seminar is a series that we do at the Wisconsin Energy Institute and online every other week on Mondays during the spring and fall semesters. The goal is to bring together many different parts of campus to talk about sustainable energy challenges and how faculty experts are developing solutions. This is also a course for students in the Certificate in Engineering for Energy Sustainability, as well as the Sustainable Systems Engineering Master's Program. We are recording this, so it will be posted on the Wisconsin Energy Institute YouTube page, and we will have a live transcript available as soon as I click on the button to do that. If you do have a question online, you can use the Q&A box and we'll direct your question to our guest speaker today. So our guest speaker is Mark Copelovitch. He is a professor in political science and public affairs here at UW-Madison. His expertise is in international political economy, international organizations with a focus on the politics of international trade, international finance, international monetary fund, and European integration. He's also the director of European Studies here at UW-Madison. This is a great moment to bring him in to talk about many things that are very much in news today with the war in Ukraine, with inflation around the globe. So he'll be talking about the international politics of a lot of these issues, including sanctions with Russia. Welcome. Great.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. I'm glad to be here. I am not an energy expert by any means on climate or energy, and so I will bring some of my expertise on political science and international relations. I study international affairs. I teach about international cooperation, the links between domestic politics and international cooperation, and the politics of the global economy. So what I thought I would do today is three things. First, just kind of bring in a few key concepts that we think about in political science and international relations that I think are really important for understanding the politics of climate and energy and sanctions. Then I'll talk about what I see as some of the really key constraints politically for kind of the world's great powers. Think about the United States, China, the EU in particular, the three largest countries or blocks in the global economy. What are the political challenges to dealing with energy and climate issues? Yeah. Mute my computer. I'm muted.
Go to the Zoom. Right there.
There. All right. Better?
Is that better, everyone?
Good. Okay. Sorry about that. So, I think what I will emphasize, even though I study international relations, is a lot of what goes on with the international politics, not only of climate or energy, but most issues, is all of the actors at the international table is facing domestic political constraints. And it's really the domestic politics that drives things. And then finally, hopefully I will have time, I'll talk more specifically about the financial sanctions, and in particular, the energy aspects of the financial sanctions around Russia and Ukraine. All right, so the first thing I want to think about is when we think about international relations and we think about the US and Russia, or the US and China, or the US and EU bargaining over issues, first question we think about is who is powerful, who has leverage in those negotiations? How do we measure power? Right? What makes countries powerful? And we often start with something like gross domestic product, the overall size of your economy, how big you are in the global economy. So this is one way to view the world, is to think about who are the countries that are big by GDP. A different way to view the world, of course, is then to think about wealth or GDP per capita. Right? So you divide that by population, and you see that the world looks very different. Right? There are large countries like China and India that are very big in the global economy, or big when you measure by GDP or population. But when you start to look at GDP per capita, we have what we talk about in international relations is the North-South gap. Right? You see very much the rich, powerful countries in the global economy You have the US and Canada in North America. You have the European Union. You have Japan, right? And you see that China and India in particular, and countries in Africa and South America are much smaller, right? And so another way to think about power is much of the global politics of anything having to do with economic policy is driven by the large Western wealthy countries. Yeah, the other way we think about power, in some ways in international relations, the classic way we think about power is to think about guns and bombs, right? And so often when you think about who is big and powerful, as we're thinking about with Russia invading Ukraine, we're talking about size of militaries, we're talking about nuclear weapons, right? And this is one way to start to think about a lot of the talk in the news on global economic issues these days, or global issues in general, is China is rising, they're displacing the United States as the global hegemon, et cetera. When you look at things militarily, the world looks different, right? You still have the US and Russia as the two nuclear superpowers of the world. China is increasing their nuclear arsenal. Their estimates, I think, are that they're going to increase their nuclear arsenal by a factor of 4 over the next 20 or 30 years, but that will still leave them very far behind the US and the United States. And when you start to think about things like overall military spending, force projection, right, aircraft carriers, the footprint of the United States military, there's still a very big gap, right? So there's no other country in the world that has its military, right, all over the world the way the United States does. And there's no other country in the world that has the ability to project force with aircraft carriers and long-range cargo planes and things like that in the way that the United States does. Now, I'm a scholar of international political economy, so I study the economic side and not the security side of international relations. So if you ask me what makes countries powerful in the international system, I'm going to tell you it's about money and finance, right? And this will play into what I'm going to talk about with financial sanctions, right, and dealing with energy issues over the next 20 minutes or so. The United States financial and monetary power is unprecedented. Right. We have been talking for as long as I've been alive. I'm 46 years old. We've been talking in the American political debate about the end of American hegemony or dominance in the international system and the decline of the US economy for as long as I've been alive. And when you start to think about monetary and financial power, right, actually the United States is more powerful now than we've ever been, right? And the gap is actually widened, not closed. So what are you looking at here? If you look on the right, you're looking at the world's reserve currencies. That is all of the world's central banks and governments. Which currencies do they hold as foreign exchange reserves, right? To participate in the global economy, to back their own currencies, to engage in international financial and trade transactions. And you see that 60% plus of global reserves are still dollars. It's been that way for about 4 decades now, right? And there's been a prognostication in the 80s, the German Deutschmark and the yen were going to surpass the dollar. Then the euro was going to surpass the dollar. We're talking now about the Chinese renminbi one day. Countries are going to hold that instead of the dollar. That is decades at least away from happening. So you see basically the world economy runs on dollars and euros and a little bit Japanese yen, British pounds, Canadian loonies. You see the Chinese renminbi is a very, very small share. Right. So China, even though it has become very big and important in global trade markets, in global energy markets, when we talk about global finance, China is actually very small, right, relative to the United States. What you're looking at on the left here is just a bunch of other measures, right? So it's not just who holds foreign exchange reserves, it's what currency global loans are denominated in, what currency international bond issues are denominated in, what currencies are trade invoiced in, and you see SWIFT payments over there. You've probably heard with the financial sanctions of Russia about SWIFT. SWIFT is kind of the computer network by which global financial transactions take place. And about 40% of the transactions are denominated in dollars, right? So the US dollar is unsurpassed in many ways. And that gets us to start thinking about not only power, but what we call interdependence in the global economy. And what I'm going to call asymmetric interdependence, which is the unevenness of that. So these are a couple of my favorite charts for thinking about who is big and important and powerful and who is less so in the world economy. On the left, you have global trade. So this is world exports, and you see the size of the circles, and then you see the arrows connecting countries. Right? So what you notice is you have the EU countries, and you have China and the United States, right, dominate global trade. On the right, you're looking at global finance. So this is portfolio investment. So stocks and flows of things like bond investment, bank flows, right? Stock market investments across the world. And what you see there is you still have the US and you still have the European Union countries. You have Japan, you see China is much smaller. Just to file away for a few minutes from now, the country you have to squint to see on both of those is Russia, right? So you see Russia is relatively unimportant in world trade and incredibly unimportant in international finance. Now, as we know, as you all know, because you're the climate and energy experts and I'm not, Russia is very important in world energy markets, right? They're very important as an exporter of certain commodities and metals, wheat, nickel, et cetera. But when we think about the relative power of Russia versus China versus the EU versus the United States, Russia is very small. So that was the first thing I wanted to just set out. And the sort of concepts from international relations that we think about is, how do we measure power? How do we measure who is big and who is not? And that idea actually of interdependence then is, if you're going to unhook from relations with a country, if that country is very big in global trade and global finance, it's harder to unhook, right? So one way we can think about it is the US and the EU unhooking from China on trade is very, very difficult, right? Even though the previous presidential administration made it a centerpiece of its policy to unhook from trade with China, right? And the current administration has actually continued many of those policies. That's very difficult to do, right? If you're thinking about the US and the EU unhooking from Russia, on energy, that may be difficult. On trade overall and on finance, that's a lot easier. Right? We are a lot less interdependent on Russia than we are on China. And there's variation, as I'll talk about. When you think about Germany or countries in the Baltics, right, they are much more interdependent with Russia than, say, the United States or Canada is. Right? So there's a lot of variation on that as well. Now, before I jump into some of the energy issues, the other thing I wanted to talk about was just a little bit about how we as political scientists think about international cooperation and international negotiations. So I kind of want to just throw out two concepts here. One is on the right, what we call two-level games. All right, so I mentioned at the start that a lot of international relations is actually about the domestic politics and the domestic political constraints that leaders and countries bring to the table. Right? If you're talking about negotiating the Paris Agreement, you're talking about negotiating a trade agreement between countries. A lot of that is the fact that you not only need to get agreement of all of the countries around the table on what we're going to cooperate on, but then those agreements have to be ratified at home, right? They have to gain the political support of the public or powerful lobbying groups domestically, or often, as in the case of the United States, they have to get ratified in the parliament, right? So a lot of international agreements, there's a long history of international agreements dating back to the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, of international agreements dying on the floor of the United States Senate, right? Because you can't get the domestic political support to ratify the treaty, right? That happened with the Versailles Treaty, that happened with Kyoto, that happened with the Treaty about the International Criminal Court, right? So, and it shapes international negotiations. We're not the only country bringing our domestic politics to the table. The Chinese have their own domestic politics. The Germans and the French and the British and the Canadians and the Japanese have their own domestic politics. The Brazilians and the Argentines have their own domestic politics. And so the bigger the table gets, the more collective action problems we have globally and the harder it is to get agreements, but also the more domestic political constraints there are. And that makes international cooperation difficult. The other concept, and as you see on the left here, is the concept of the credibility of commitments, right? So when countries are signing international agreements and they're thinking about cooperating with each other, they're thinking about making concessions in negotiations, but they're also thinking about the reliability of their negotiating partners, right? If I give up something and I make a concession, right? The other side, I'm going to ask them to make concessions. Are they going to cheat? Are they going to live up to their agreements? Are they going to stay at the table and continue cooperating with me if things get difficult politically at home? And I bring that up because we're in an era right now where the United States increasingly faces a credibility problem negotiating in international relations because of the behavior of multiple previous administrations backing out of agreements that were signed. Right? So if you sign agreements and they don't get ratified by the United States Senate, or you walk away from very difficult, painstakingly negotiated agreements, like the Trump administration did with the Paris Agreement and with the Iran nuclear deal, it becomes more difficult, right, to sit at the table internationally and say, trust me, you should make concessions and I'm going to make concessions and I'm going to live up and hold up to my end of the bargain. Right? So when we think about what makes international negotiations and international cooperation difficult, the links between domestic politics and international relations and the credible commitments problem are two of the really big problems that we think about. And I think if you think about climate negotiations, energy negotiations, the EU countries trying to reach an agreement amongst 27 countries about whether or not they should embargo Russian gas, right? These types of problems are the types of problems that are really the limiting factors about whether we can do those sorts of things. All right, so some of the questions that come up policy-wise, I'll just kind of throw these out and I'm happy in the Q&A to talk more about them. But someone like me who's an international relations scholar and a political scientist, these are some of the questions that come to my mind when we think about the politics of climate and energy. Right? One is, are there ways to use the institutions that we have that have locked in cooperation on other issues, in particular on trade and finance? Can you incorporate climate and energy issues into those agreements, right? Rather than negotiating a global environmental organization, are there ways you can use the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, these international organizations that have enforcement mechanisms, right, and standing bodies and bureaucracies? Can we incorporate climate and energy issues into those institutions so we're not reinventing the wheel of negotiating new organizations? On the domestic politics side, you can think about linkage between climate and energy problems and other issues, right? So when we think about how China thinks about energy issues and climate issues, it's very difficult to separate those from thinking about how the Chinese authoritarian regime thinks about survival, right? If it makes concessions on energy issues or climate issues, is that going to lead to demands for political liberalization, et cetera? You can also think about the flip side of what I said about using existing institutions. Is there are already a lot of divisions around the world on trade and financial issues about globalization. If you then throw in the divisions and issues about climate change and energy onto the table, does that fuel a further populist nationalist backlash to globalization? Right. One of the big things we've seen over the last decade now, almost 15 years since the global financial crisis, is domestic backlash against trade, against finance, against globalization more broadly. So the more that you have right-wing and left-wing populist parties saying we want less globalization, right, that also might inhibit cooperation on things like climate change and energy. And then to flip it around in another way, if you think about major initiatives that have happened on energy and trade and other investment over the history of the world since 1945, often those happen in times of crisis, right? So if you think about big US investments in things like infrastructure and nuclear energy, if you think about the Marshall Plan, right, to aid and rebuild Europe after World War II, often external crises and threats were what got the United States in particular to generate the domestic political support for big investments. Right? So one of the things people have been talking about over the last 4 weeks now, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is whether both in the US and Europe, this external threat of Russia and war is now actually going to push forward, right, domestic political momentum for alternative energy and some sort of, global climate and energy investment that we haven't seen to date. Again, that's an open question, I think. Right. A couple other questions just related to international conflict is whether or not climate and energy shortages are something that might be fodder for future territorial conflict, and whether what we're seeing about climate change and energy shortages is sort of a straw that broke the camel's back, right? A lot of talk again about the rollback of globalization in the last 5 or 10 years. And if you throw in global warming and climate change and energy crises, you could imagine a lot of the political momentum is to turn further inward, right? Protect ourselves, pursue our national goals, possibly at the expense of international cooperation. All right, so that's a little bit there on kind of conceptually and broadly from the standpoint of political science and international relations, how we think about the politics of energy and climate. Let me spend a few minutes now talking about the international and domestic politics of climate and energy in kind of the big three countries in the global economy. And I'll kind of talk about the EU as a country. The EU is somewhere between a regular international organization and the United States of Europe, right? It's not quite a super state yet, but it is 27 countries that are more deeply integrated than any other block of countries in the world, to the point that we really can't think about them as one economy and politically as a unit in international relations, right? So if we think about who faces the hardest political and economic constraints in meeting challenges around energy and climate over the next several decades, my argument would be, with all our problems, actually the US faces the least constraints, right? That we are the least constrained, and those constraints are mostly about domestic politics. Right? We have unparalleled monetary and financial dominance, as I talked about. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And we are less dependent on authoritarian and non-allied countries for energy than either the EU or China. Right? So we face less constraints, and I'll unpack that in a second. The EU, as we know, is very dependent on Russia. That brings a lot of economic and political risks in terms of its energy needs. And the EU is facing a lot of crises, right? A brief history of the European Union since 2010 is nonstop multiple crises. And the big question in the EU is about the bandwidth to deal with climate and energy issues, because they've been dealing with Brexit, the European financial crisis, and a threat of authoritarian regimes from within with Poland and Hungary. So there's a lot going on in the EU, and the political momentum to address climate and energy, it's not clear there's the bandwidth, both domestically within key countries like Germany and France, but then also as a block of 27 countries. Again, I'll unpack that as well. China has its own sets of issues, and my take on China is it has probably the most severe energy and climate problems over the next several decades, and is in the midst of figuring out whether or not its economic development and political model is really sustainable. And China, in many ways, is the most vulnerable to trade and fossil fuel dependence, also on authoritarian regimes, and faces challenges that, depending on how you look at them, make the challenges of the US and the EU look like relatively small challenges. So let me unpack those a little, right? So when we think about the US, a lot of the political debate, when you read about in the news, what you hear about in Congress, what you hear politicians talking about in the United States, is basically we can't address our energy and climate issues because we can't afford to spend on blank, right? And this is where I have a different take than a lot of people in political science and elsewhere, but this is where my take about the monetary and financial dominance of the United States really kind of reflects how I think about this. So what are you looking at here? You are looking at a chart with two things. One is, pull up the pointer here. This is the number that everybody gets scared about, and you want to look on the left axis. This is our debt to GDP ratio. Okay, so how much debt the US government has relative to the size of the economy, right? And you see a big scary number. We're at about 120% of GDP now. That's higher than any time since World War II. And you see that number has gone up massively, right? It's doubled in the last 20 years. So everybody looks at that and says, oh my God, we're passing on all this debt to our grandchildren. The US isn't going to be able to afford things. We're going to default. We have to tighten our belts and cut back on the federal budget. We can't afford to invest in climate change, energy, things like that. The other one, this one here with the right axis, is the interest on the debt as a share of GDP. You'll see that number is lower than it's been at any time since 1960. That's because world interest rates are lower than they've been at any time since World War II. And there is 40 times the amount of money flowing around in the global financial system now than there was back in 1985. Okay, so there's a lot more money looking to invest in things in the world, the US borrows at an interest rate over 30 years of 2%, right? And if you adjust that for inflation, people are actually paying us to hold their money for 30%, for 30 years, right? What this actually means is I will buy a US bond for $100 today. And in inflation adjusted terms, you will give me back $99.84 30 years from now. So that's a very different perspective, right? So if you put that together with what I showed you earlier about the dominance of the dollar in the world economy and the global demand for holding US dollars, it starts to look very different, that maybe this isn't such a big scary number, right? Maybe we can sustain our borrowing and investment on all kinds of public things, energy included, over the next 50 years, 70 years. Right? And another way to think about that then is the relative cost of borrowing for us versus other countries, right? So this is the interest rate on 10-year bonds for China, the US, Japan, Germany, and the UK, right? And you see the US and the European countries borrow at very, very low rates. China borrows at much higher rates, right? So if you accumulate the cost of investment over 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, right? China is going to pay a lot more to access the resources it needs to address its energy needs than the Europeans are or the United States is. So that's one way to think about the ability of the United States, or the relative lack of constraints, right? You often hear analogies to the government being a household, right? That we're running up too much debt, the credit cards are being maxed out as a country, we can't afford to invest and spend in things. Well, households don't live forever, households don't invest dollars, households don't raise money through tax revenue, and households can't issue effectively unlimited bonds at negative real interest rates for 30 years. Right, so the constraints of the US government are very different and much looser, I would argue, than a lot of people think they are, and then much of the American political debate about, can we invest in alternative energy? Can we invest in infrastructure? Could we upgrade our energy grids? All of those things that we need to do, that we have a lot more autonomy than we think we do in the standard political debate. The other thing is, just to kind of flag this, and then I'll talk about it in relation again to the EU and China, is if you do think about that idea of asymmetric interdependence, right? Who are we interdependent on with energy? The world is very different from the 1970s in the era of the oil shocks and our dependence on OPEC, right? Or our dependence on Russia. Between our own oil production and oil production with the oil imports we have with Canada, right? We are far less dependent on authoritarian countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia than China is itself, or than the EU countries are. So that also gives the US more geopolitical autonomy to deal with its energy issues than the other big countries in the global economy. Now, let me say a little bit about China then. Right, so when we think about the constraints China has in dealing with its energy issues, the first thing you want to think about is whether the Chinese development model is really sustainable, right? And the big thing there is whether China gets old before it gets rich, right? So China's economic miracle over the last 30 years is historically unprecedented, right? The only thing close is Korea, right, since the 1950s. China has gone from being one of the poorest countries in the world to being a middle income country, right? And one of the two largest economies in the world in a span of 30 to 35 years. It's extraordinary, right? But it has done that with an export-led growth model, and one that is dependent on 5 to 7 to 10% economic growth year after year after year, right? And you'll see the Chinese economic growth is stagnating, right? You see here GDP per capita, right? For China and the United States, right? So you see an upper middle rich country versus a middle income country, right? So China is in GDP terms as big as we are now. In GDP per capita terms, right? China is very far behind, right? So they have gone from being very poor to being middle income. They have not fully developed, right? A sort of full development would be catching up to the US, right? Surpassing the US on GDP, catching up to the US on GDP per capita. Right? And you'll see China's growth rate has declined to the point that it's really only at about 2% now. So China faces a problem of over the next 30 years, right? How does it sustain growth the way it did in the 90s and 2000s to keep developing in terms of GDP per capita? It's not obvious that the export-led growth model based on manufactured exports that China has pursued successfully from the 90s till today will work to get it over 2020 to 2050 to being a rich country like a Germany or a France or a Canada or the United States. And China faces a demographic problem, right? So what you see here are population pyramid charts. You've got the United States and you've got China. I imagine a lot of you have probably seen charts like this. When you have the inverted pyramid, that means you have a lot more old people than young people, right? It's hard to grow fast, right? When you have a shrinking workforce and tax base and you have more of an aging population, right? That is retired, that is being supported by pensions, things like that. Immigration in many ways, if you look at the US and Canada, you see this type of chart. If you look at EU countries, you see this type of chart. If you look at Japan, you see this type of chart, right? So in many ways, over the last 150 years, immigration has been the secret weapon of the United States, right? So sort of our population has stayed young and that has enabled us to continue to grow fast and develop. So China faces a set of questions right now in the face of demographic, pandemic challenges, the geopolitical rivalry. We'll talk about a new Cold War with the US and China, tensions with Taiwan and Japan, environmental problems, as I'll show you in a second, financial problems. There's a series of challenges China faces, and this is the biggest one, right? How does an authoritarian regime address all of these challenges, continue to grow and develop, and not face pressures domestically to democratize, right? And if they do face pressures to democratize, does that happen peacefully or does that happen with a kind of more violent revolution, right? The number of peaceful transitions to democracy that have been accompanied by high economic growth is a very, very small number of cases in world history. The other thing with China is the financial one, right? So I'll just kind of throw this up quickly. I'm happy to talk more in Q&A about it. This is private credit growth % per year in the US and China. And this is that number as a share of GDP, right? And this kind of ties into the question of like, who can afford what, right? So one of the reasons China has been growing so fast over the last 20 years is because the state-run banking system has been flushing credit into the economy, right? A lot of the credit that's labeled private credit in China is actually through the state-owned banking system, so it's sort of quasi-governmental. But what happens historically, I study financial crises, what happens historically in countries over the last 40 years that have this much money being pushed through the banking system into the economy is ultimately you get failing banks, real estate bubbles, and a sovereign debt crisis, right? And a big financial crisis that hurts the economy. That's what happened in Latin American countries in the 1980s, what happened in East Asian countries like Thailand and Korea in the 1990s. It's what happened in the US with the real estate and subprime mortgage crisis in 2007 and 2008. So this is another ticking time bomb for China, right? And again, if you put all of those things together, the question then is which of the countries, US or China, has more bandwidth to deal with climate and energy problems? And again, I would argue that China's problems are much more severe than ours are. That is just in relation to the US chart I showed you of who is dependent on whom for energy. What's that?
Didn't mention ecological.
Yes, much more serious environmental degradation problems as well. And China is much more dependent on other authoritarian regimes for energy. Right? So again, if you think about that interdependence aspect, it's going to be harder for China to unhook from a petroleum-driven economy and ties to other authoritarian countries in the years ahead. Now, lastly, let me say something about the EU. And the EU, the big issue, as everybody has been talking about in the news for the last month now, is dependence on Russian gas. Right. So the chart on the left is one from the Financial Times last week, which I think is a nice chart. It shows who is dependent on whom for gas exports or gas imports. And you see the many things in the EU are driven by Germany and German domestic politics. Germany is the largest economy in the EU and the most powerful country in the EU. And German dependence on Russian gas is a huge domestic political issue in Germany, but it's a huge economic issue for the EU as a whole. Now, one of the things we've seen this week is the Baltic states and Poland talking about we're actually going to cut ourselves off completely from Russian gas. Right? How fast that is actually going to happen is something that remains to be seen. And whether a country that is as dependent on Russia as Germany really can pull that off without a major hit to its economy is also something that remains to be seen. This is where that two-level game concept comes in. So I came across this chart this week. I really like it. It shows on the x-axis the share of gas in total energy consumption amongst the 27 EU countries. And so these are the abbreviations: Netherlands, Italy, Latvia, Romania, Spain, Portugal, etc. You see Hungary up here. You see Germany here. The y-axis is the share of imports from Russia. So how dependent are you on gas, and how dependent are you on Russian imports of gas? And you see the Germans are up here. The Hungarians are the ones that are most exposed. Right? You see the Netherlands and Italy are very dependent on gas, but not so much on Russia. Right? They're getting more of their natural gas from other sources like Norway, etc. And then you see countries like Sweden, right, that are over here, Poland, that are less exposed. Right? So why is the Polish government more willing than the German government to say we're going to cut ourselves off from Russian gas Russian gas imports? Because there's less interdependence. Right? So now that's where the two-level games concept comes in as well, because in Brussels, there are 27 countries coming to the table and saying, what should the EU do about a Russian gas embargo? And the Hungarians and the Dutch and the Germans and the Poles and the Irish don't agree, right? And so that's the EU equivalent of kind of congressional politics or domestic politics in the United States about what we should do about this stuff, is bargaining in Brussels, right, in the European Council and the European Parliament about what the EU should do as a bloc. I'll just throw this up. It's an interesting study. You may want to look it up. It's from the DIW in Berlin, German economic think tank in Berlin. There was a study done of how much of a hit would a Russian oil embargo and gas embargo actually inflict on the EU over the next 10 years, right? So these are quarters, so 0 to 40 is 10 years. This is capital stock, productivity, tax revenue, consumption, inflation, investment, and this is the debt ratio, I believe. My German is rusty. But so it's an interesting study of people trying to project exactly what is the economic hit, because the magnitude of the economic hit will also shape the politics of whether or not this is something that the EU thinks it can do. Now, as I mentioned, the other thing with the EU is they're dealing with a lot of crap, right? So the EU is thinking about climate and energy issues at the same time as it's dealing with the fact that the European financial crisis never really ended. So this is my favorite chart to think about Europe. This is real gross domestic product for Greece and Italy, indexed to 100 in 2007. What are you seeing when you look at this chart? Italy, for the entire time Italy has been a member of the Eurozone, the single currency, Italy's economy has not grown. And so it's a long-term structural problem with the Eurozone, as the Eurozone has been very good for growth for Germany and the Netherlands, much worse for the Southern European countries like Portugal and Italy. This is the big problem, which is Greece's economy is 30% below 12 years later where it was at the start of the European financial crisis. So to translate that into words we all understand as Americans, this is something worse than the Great Depression that has been 3 times as long as the Great Depression and is projected to last for another 20 to 30 years. Right? So one big crisis, the big crisis the EU is dealing with economically, is the last crisis the Germans and the Dutch recovered, and countries like Greece and Italy never did. Right? So their economies are bad going into the COVID crisis. right? And they're, thinking about, do they have the capacity to invest in climate and energy issues? It's not clear. Second one is, you may have seen there was an election in Hungary and Viktor Orban was reelected yesterday, right? And so the other challenge that the EU, ostensibly as a league of rich democracies, is wrestling with is the fact that it now has authoritarian countries sitting at the table, right? And Poland and Hungary, run by far-right authoritarian parties, aren't as interested in standing up to Russia as maybe France or the Netherlands or Belgium, right, or Italy is. And so that's a big problem within. And again, we have this domestic politics two-level games problem. Now, the other one, of course, is Russia invades Ukraine. All right, so let me just spend a few minutes, the rest of the time that I have, can I go 5 more minutes? Is that okay? Okay. On the sanctions side of things, right? So the big economic news, right, the political and economic response to Russia invading Ukraine has been this massive coordinated financial sanctions of the G7 countries, right? The world's leading Western democracies. So you have the US, the EU, Japan, Canada, the UK, Switzerland, et cetera. This has actually been a somewhat unprecedented major demonstration of the kind of West's continued power and dominance in the global economy. And so I was talking about money being power and the US's unquestioned financial dominance. It's been pretty striking in 4 weeks how Russia has been completely cut off, except for gas, right, from the world economy, right? It's been an object lesson in just how dollar dominated or dollar euro denominated the global banking and financial system is. That this set of sanctions that have been imposed, right, targeting the central bank reserves, cutting off Russia's banks from SWIFT, confiscating some of the yachts of Roman Abramovich and the other oligarchs, trade sanctions, blocking Russian corporations from engaging in trade and finance, right? And now the talks about whether there's going to be boycotts of gas. So on the one hand, lots of people are thinking we need to do more, right? Especially on not providing Russia with hard currency because of gas imports. But the flip side is, in a month, right, the West has basically cut Russia off completely in an unprecedented way from the global economy, right? So that's been a massive show of force. And when we think about that show of force, there's really two audiences. One is, it's an international signal, right? It's a signal to Russia of, we are going to make it extremely expensive economically for you to continue fighting this war, right? There's already in the news a lot of disillusions with sanctions, right? But I think a lot of that is confusion of what sanctions are and aren't, right? Sanctions are not a substitute for military aid. They're not a substitute for fighting a war. They're not actually intended to be. What they're intended to do is to raise the economic and political cost of fighting a war, right? So sanctions are not a cure-all. They're not going to solve the problems in Ukraine. They're not going to end the human rights violations that are happening in Ukraine. What they have done successfully is devastated the Russian economy. And that raises questions about how long Russia actually will be able to sustain the military effort, right? So that's one signal. It's the signal out from the West to Russia, right? And from the West to China and the rest of the world of, we actually have a lot of power, right? I don't think this is primarily about the US thinking about China and Taiwan, but it's hard to think that the Chinese are not looking at this and thinking about, what if we invaded Taiwan? And that the US and the Europeans are not thinking about, we want this to be a little bit of a signal to the Chinese government of thinking about what the cost would be for them to engage in that sort of thing, right? The other signal, though, is domestically, right? So this is a signal downward, governments to public saying we are doing something, right? And the Biden administration is doing a very careful dance now of trying to show that it's doing things, also recognizing there probably isn't domestic political support for a shooting war with the other nuclear power, right? And so there's a delicate dance domestically. Now, when we think about this question, when I talked about Russia and interdependence, another way to look about it is on trade, right? So you have German imports by country and American imports by country, and you see here our non-dependence on Russia, right? And Russia being a bigger trading partner with Germany and the EU countries over here. Now, that's magnified. Russia may be small in trade and finance, but they're very big, right, when we think about commodities, right? So if you're thinking about wheat, rare earth elements, gas, nickel, et cetera, right? Russia is one of the large players in the global economy, and that's where the inflation and the supply shocks and the concerns, right, are really going to be. Now, politically, we're talking about that a lot here in the US, and the Europeans are talking about a lot that, right? The countries that are actually going to be hit most by those things are actually developing countries, right? Like Egypt and elsewhere that are much more dependent on Russian agricultural imports, fertilizer, things like that, right? So when we think about that interdependence at the kind of global geopolitical great power level, it's one thing. A lot of the negative economic spillovers that we're going to see in terms of trade and finance over the next year are much more on developing countries, right? Much bigger hits for poorer countries that are much more dependent on Russia for various commodity imports and exports, right? So these are some of the key questions with sanctions here. What's the economic impact going to be? Short, medium, long term, this is devastating to the Russian economy. The sanctions are going to continue to be escalated, right? An increasing stringency of them. I do think what you're going to see over the next 6 months to a year is something close to a full embargo, right? That's going to take time, and it's going to have implications for energy prices, but I think it will happen. The other thing you're going to see is what are known as secondary sanctions, which are sanctions on third parties, right, that are trading with Russia. So you could imagine sanctions on China and other countries that continue to trade with Russia. And again, will they work? Well, compared to what's the timeline? And also, right, sanctions will work economically, but again, they're not a substitute for military intervention. And if we expect, financial sanctions to stop the war, right, or stop the human rights violations, I think that's probably the wrong way, unfortunately, to think about it. All right, I'm going to skip over that. Skip over this, just kind of talk a little bit. Happy to talk a little bit more about some of the details of the trade and financial stuff in Q&A if people have on sanctions. But just kind of a couple more words in summing up how I think about them. They are unprecedented in scale, scope, and speed, right? So the only closest analogy of this degree of comprehensive Western sanctions really choking off a country from the global economy was the sanctions on Iran before the Iran deal, right? The ones that were relaxed after the Iran deal, put back partly in place when the Trump administration withdrew, and is now still in place because there hasn't been a new agreement or complete return to the table. But these are even bigger and faster and more extensive in scale and scope and speed. And there are some geopolitical lessons from this. Again, I think it really highlights the dominance of the US monetarily and financially in the West more broadly compared to Russia and China. It highlights that the world's a dangerous place and it's good to have friends, right? The Russians are incredibly isolated right now, right? Ostensibly, Russia and China are standing shoulder to shoulder on a lot of global economic and geopolitical issues. But China's been very careful, right, and cagey about exactly how much it's supporting Russia in the war effort. It abstained rather than voted against the UN General Assembly resolution a couple of weeks ago, right, to condemn the invasion. So Russia is much more isolated. The EU and NATO are in many ways have been reinvigorated in the last 3 or 4 weeks by this common external threat, which is not surprising. The sort of history of both the EU and NATO is there tends to be a lot more action and cooperation when there's a very clear external threat. And we're in a timeline where that exists. And again, I think what it's highlighted is this kind of asymmetry and weaponization of the interdependence, right? The US is really throwing around, or the US and the Europeans, throwing around our financial leverage in the global economy. At the same time that we are struggling with the fact that we are interdependent with Russia on things like agricultural commodities and energy, really trying to do a dance of how do you fight a geopolitical conflict or a military conflict in a time when there's so much economic interdependence? It's one of the age-old questions in international relations. This is the latest manifestation of it. So I think I'll stop there. I'm happy to take people's questions.
Okay.
Yep.
We can start with any questions in the room, and I'll answer the questions on that.
about how much the world relies on the US dollar.
Mhm.
What in your view is going to change that?
Yeah, so what would change the global reliance on the dollar and the dollar dominance? So to think about when we think about money, there are three functions of money. One, it's a store of value, right? So it's a sort of safe investment. The other is it's a medium of exchange. So people are willing to hold it because they can use it for international trade and financial transactions. And the other is it's a unit of account. So we price things in certain currencies, right? So a lot of international trade, oil in particular, everybody prices oil in dollars, right? There's some talk of now the Chinese are going to price some of their oil in renminbi, or the Saudis are going to do that. People have been talking about that for 4 decades. It hasn't happened yet. But so you would need a currency that people believe is as reliable in performing those three functions as the dollar, right? It won't be the euro because the EU is not a country, right? So there's no, Harry Kissinger used to, joke about, like, if I pick up the phone to call Europe, like, who am I calling and who's answering the phone? But as I said, the EU is more than an international organization. It's not really a state. There is a central bank, but there's no central government, right? So it's unlikely to be the EU. It's unlikely to be China anytime soon. There's never been an authoritarian regime that's been the global, in the modern era, there's never been an authoritarian regime that's been issued the global reserve currency. It was the UK and then it was us, right? And China hasn't fully opened to global finance. It has capital controls, right? So you can invest in China, but it's very hard to take your money out of China. So people don't want to hold a currency that's not fully convertible, right? So those are the two dominant competitors. The other one people talk about is Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is even less of, there's no government behind it than the EU is. So it's a lot less, the US is like, it's not that the US doesn't have a ton of problems, it's that everybody else's problems are more serious than ours, right? So for there to be a plausible, if you said China was going to become a democracy and a rich country and open up to global finance, and in the next 80 years, the renminbi will replace the dollar, totally plausible. In the next 10, 20, 30 years, it's very hard to see an alternative. Yeah.
Seems to be a very almost reactive system, in that very difficult to anticipate the consequences of any certainly individual or actually collective set of actions. That's even an individual one. I wonder what you do to create a set of incentives to accomplish your objective.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that that would be one of the things that economists would study and try to.
So the system, you mean like the international system is very reactive, or?
Really, even domestically, but certainly internationally.
Yeah.
Much more so.
Yeah, so the system is reactive, and what do you do to try and make it more proactive and kind of work better? So, honestly, the thing you try and do is institutionalize cooperation, right? So if you think about what the US and the West did after World War II, at the start of, to the end of World War II, with setting up the IMF, setting up the World Bank, creating the GATT, which eventually became the WTO, what you do with creating institutions and agencies domestically in the government is to try and create uncertainty. Basically, the thing international relations scholars hate more in the world than anything else is uncertainty, right? And so if you don't have the credibility of commitments, and you don't lock things in with institutions where there's clear rules of the game about how countries interact and how you negotiate, then it becomes about power politics, or it becomes about who's in power. We saw that with, you negotiate a Paris agreement, but there's really no enforcement mechanism and Trump can just walk away from it. Or you negotiate a JCPOA, and by all accounts, it's actually working as designed to prevent Iran from getting closer to having nuclear weapons, but it's a non-binding agreement. And again, the United States can just walk away from it. So it's hard, right? It's hard for all of the domestic and international political reasons to reach those agreements. But the areas where we've had durable cooperation, And if you think about the world from 1945 up until today, we've had more and more unprecedented globalization and almost no interstate wars. And a lot of that has to do with things like the WTO and NATO and the European Union and altering countries' incentives by locking in institutions that structure bargaining. And that's the difficult part, is the more you have countries with very divergent interests like the US and China and Russia, or the more countries you have around the table, the harder it is to reach agreements. You know, all those institutions I talked about in the 1940s, it was basically the US was so much more powerful than everybody else, and there were 30 countries at the table. Now you have the US, EU, China, Japan, Brazil, Australia, Russia, 200 countries in the world. It's a lot harder in that type of environment to negotiate things. So I don't have any like optimistic answer for you. You know, what we know is when we institutionalize cooperation, it tends to be durable and it tends to limit the amount of backsliding you see for nationalistic and domestic political reasons. But it's very hard to reach those agreements in the first place.
Sanctions of these hyper sanctions moving to the next level of sanctions. Is that going to, for example, the election today, Orban's trying to sell that as he won't be involved.
Right.
In other words, he won't have to sanction Russia. He won't have to cut off the gas supplies. Interesting, a lot of those gas supplies come via Hungary and via the Ukraine. If there's real chaos in Ukraine, they might cut off anyway. But I it sort of boggles my mind that if you try and stretch it further than it's now,
Mhm.
the genius, I think, in the first round was that everybody came on board because nobody had to face that in Hungary.
Right.
A really moment of choice domestically.
Yeah. So how do you, going forward, does it become harder to have the more severe and secondary
I think
sanctions?
it's going to
Yes.
become- I personally don't think this can go on forever. There's some kind of force.
Mhm.
I don't know where it is, but there's some kind of force. And you look at the UN is powerless. I don't know where the force would come.
Yeah.
But you think of all the international relationships that would have to be restructured to cut off Russian gas from Europe, the biggest source.
So it cuts both ways, right? So yes, the longer you go on and the more deeper and painful the cost to us or the Europeans of these sanctions, the harder it is to get that consensus, right? The other, though, is if there's this group and all of the kind of Western countries are doing it, you can use that as the domestic scapegoat. And there's a long history of international agreements of, you know, I'm going along with things because I'm being forced to, right? It's also at some point one could imagine that, you know, if it's 26-1 in the EU, the 26 might move ahead. Right? Not everything in the EU happens with unanimity. Many things in the EU happen with unanimity. But if it's the PIS in Poland and Orban in Hungary are the only ones standing in the way, I think you're still going to see some sort of coordinated US, EU, Japan, Canada, Britain type of action.
Before this thing blew up, gas prices in Europe.
Yeah.
So they came up with extremely high base.
Right.
And where are they going to go out in the world unless there's some kind of super coordinating mechanism?
Right. Well, you know, but again, this is there's the
and everybody working right. Yeah, we could pull this off, but where is a super national coordinating base that's going to take it away from Asia, for example, and ship it to
right. So who's the coordinating mechanism?
ILG?
Yeah, on gas cooperation, and there isn't a single one, right? I think it's a combination of, you know, the U.S. is releasing. There's going to be this massive release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Over the course of the next year, Canada and the United States could have more LNG shipments going to to Europe. These are things that can take place over the course of 6 months, a year, 2 to 3 years. They're not things in the short term. We can't shift these in the short term, right? So I think a lot of the politics and the pain is in the short term, and the question is whether or not there's the political momentum to keep this up over a 2 or 3 or 4 year. I think for the interdependence reasons, if this is a war of attrition of who can hold out longer, the US and the EU can hold out against Russia a lot longer than Russia can hold out against us, right? But you're right, the question of who's gonna coordinate this, so far it's been the US, right? And I think we're in a very different game right now with the Biden administration. And if this has happened with the Trump administration, and the US kind of playing its classic role of coordinating the Western powers together.
Supposedly the International Energy Agency was supposed to coordinate questions like that.
Yeah. But that's this
body.
is one of those international institutions, unlike the IMF or the World Bank, that doesn't have a very large executive with a lot of power and money behind it. Right. So it doesn't have any mechanism by which to compel the US or the EU to get things done.
Got a couple questions online. First,
Yeah.
what does it mean to how much Russia has been cut off from money when it's still selling fossil fuels to the EU and it's insisting that they pay rubles? Are they still getting enough cash that they need to?
Right. So the ruble right now actually is effectively a non-convertible, useless currency, right? So what you saw was pre-crisis, we were at 75 rubles to the dollar. It went up to about 140. Everybody dumped their rubles, right? It's come back to about 85, but that's a fake number, right? So what's happened basically is in order to stop the currency crash, the Russian government basically said, nobody can take rubles out of the country anymore. We're seizing all of the foreign exchange that's in all of Russia's bank accounts, and we're having complete capital controls. So the Russian government now in Russia has bought enough rubles to make this the exchange rate, but there's basically no volume in currency trading, almost zero in Russia now. So this was a meaningful number in the global economy. This is sort of a fiction at this point. Nobody is trading in rubles, right?
Do you think we can make good this command?
No. I mean, we can pay him in dollars or euros. And so it is true, per the question, that there's foreign exchange going to Russia. But we have seized the reserves of the Russian central bank, right? We have a big chunk of them. And we have blocked Russian banks and corporations from engaging in trade, right? So you can accumulate dollars and euros, but the Russian government can't really spend them on anything, right? There's very little they can spend them on. They can try and use those kind of to go third party if the Chinese will accept them or other countries will accept them to buy goods. So it is true, there is still money funding the war effort indirectly. But the ability of the Russian economy, right, the Russia to kind of use all of that foreign exchange the way it did prior to February 28th, it's a very different world now.
It's just a simple mechanism of requiring everybody to pay for their gas. In other words, come to Moscow and buy rubles.
Right.
Would certainly prop up the ruble. You don't think that's impossible? Would some countries maybe give in to that and start sending their money to Moscow?
So the Germans have already said that's not going to happen. It's hard to imagine any EU country doing that. I don't think the US is going to do that, right? Again, I think, what you've seen so far is things like we're going to release hundreds of millions of barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The Germans today basically announced that they're nationalizing the Gazprom assets there in Germany. So there's a lot of things that are going to happen, again, in terms of retaliation before you agree to buy your gas in rubles. And again, it comes down to this war of attrition, right? So Putin can say he wants that and it's symbolic. It's not clear what that means over 6 months to a year to 2 years, right? The Russians don't have, right, over that time period, the Russians don't have the leverage. And in the short term, the war is not, there'd be a lot more leverage if the war was going well for the Russians in a way that everybody expected it was going to.
One more question.
Yeah.
Can you discuss the EU's imminent border carbon adjustment? and
Mhm.
its impact on US trade and possibility of the US border carbon adjustment with or without a US carbon tax.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't know much about the impact on trade. I mean, I think the thing I would say is a lot of those types of issues, you know, a lot of US EU trade issues over the last 10 years, right? About carbon taxes, about clean energy, about genetically modified organisms. There's a lot of sort of, you know, the US and the EU throwing their weight around and wanting the other entity to kind of adopt their standards and preferences on trade policy and regulation. I think in this current environment with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, and also with, you know, both sides, the US and the EU, viewing China more as a geopolitical and economic threat, I feel like those things kind of get pushed a little bit more to the back burner, right? So it's hard to imagine with Congress structured the way it is that a US carbon price is happening anytime soon. And it's hard to imagine that any trade agreement the Biden administration might negotiate with the EU that would address these types of border carbon adjustments and carbon taxes and harmonized regulations about climate would get through a Senate in which Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin are the median voters. Or kind of, you know, we'll know in November what the next 2 years of the United States Senate looks like. But that's again where the domestic politics comes in, right? And it links up to these international issues of, you know, the US EU trade spats, just kind of like the US Canada trade fights that were big in the news in 2017, 2018. Like, you tend not to hear about those friends fighting amongst each other as much when there's this big external security threat. You see the same thing in the EU. The Germans and the French don't agree on very much of anything, and they're always kind of fighting. There's been very little in the way of disagreements between Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron, right, over the last 3, 4, 5 weeks now. So I would expect to see that post Russia, Ukraine. I just don't know when post Russia, Ukraine is going to be anytime soon. There's one more here about shift alternative energy going to speed up. Can there be a Manhattan Project? So that's kind of what I had in mind when I was saying crises drive things, right? So if you think about the Marshall Plan and the impetus to restructure Europe after World War II took 4 years, and it was the Soviet threat and the onset of the Cold War that got the US to invest in rebuilding not only our allies, but also Germany, right? So if you thought about, we've been trying to think about a Green New Deal or some Manhattan Project for alternative energy for the last 10, 15 years now. There's never political momentum for it, right? Both in the EU and in the United States, scaring the public that we need to do this because we're so dependent on Russia and that's a national security threat. Yes, I think that can shape public opinion and domestic politics. I think if this becomes a conflict that goes on for years rather than months, that is exactly what you'll see on both sides of the Atlantic, right? And maybe even some coordinated US, EU, Canada, Japan type of joint initiative to invest in alternative energy. So there's a long history of that, of international relations, as you get over the domestic political hurdles to these things when you have an external military and security threat.
Would China not also be interested in something like that?
They would, but to some extent, China is the other external threat that we use domestically in the United States to mobilize that, right? So,
Not with respect to oil.
right. So you can imagine it going 2 ways. You can imagine we use Russia and China and dependence on authoritarian countries for trade and energy means the West has to go and invest in a Manhattan Project on alternative energy, or China realizes, like the EU and the US, we're all in the same boat on energy dependence, and there's some sort of tripartite cooperation. Those are both possible, but they're two very different. You know, what it would look like if it was the US and China cooperating would be very different than if it was the US and the EU and the Canadians kind of cooperating on something. So I do think if this, you know, if the Russia-Ukraine conflict goes on for 2, 3, 4 years, I think you're really going to see something along those lines. Again, I'm not the energy expert, so you all know like what that would look like in terms of concrete types of investments and policies, but I think the political momentum for it would be there.
For all the time, but thanks so much for your presentation and for answering questions today.
Yeah, great. Thank you for having me.